They didn't sell humans with dignity. They sold them like bruised fruit paraded on splintered wooden blocks in the freezing rain. Maeve was supposed to be fodder for the Ironjaw pack, meant to scrub their blood-stained floors and warm their beds until her spirit finally snapped. But the Alpha King wasn't supposed to be there that day. He wasn't supposed to step out of the shadows, rip the rough linen from her shoulder, and freeze at the sight of the silver scar resting on her collarbone. The mud in Everhaven smelled of pig shit and cheap ale. It sucked at the soles of her bare feet, pulling at her like the earth itself was trying to drag her down before the auctioneer could. Her uncle had traded her for 4 copper coins and a half-empty flask of rotgut. She didn't cry when he handed over her tether. Tears were a luxury for girls who had mothers to wipe them away. She just stared at the back of his greasy coat as he stumbled out of the square, disappearing into the fog. The rope around her wrists was frayed, biting into her skin with every shift of her weight. There were 12 of them on the wooden platform, mostly women, a few young boys. They huddled together, shivering under the relentless drizzle of late autumn. Nobody spoke. The silence of the condemned is a heavy, suffocating thing. "Teeth open!" the auctioneer barked. A thick-fingered man smelling of stale onions grabbed her jaw and pried her mouth open. She tasted dirt and salt. He ran a filthy thumb over her gums. Good teeth, wide hips. Breed her or bleed her, she'll last the winter. The crowd below was a blur of wool cloaks and hungry eyes. Humans looking for cheap labor. Low-ranking wolves looking for cheaper playthings. Then the crowd parted. They didn't just move. They shoved each other into the mud to clear a path. The air grew immediately heavier, thick with the scent of pine iron and fresh blood. 3 men stepped forward. They didn't wear the drab wool of the villagers. They wore boiled leather and heavy furs, their chests broad, their stances loose but impossibly predatory. The Ironjaw pack. Even in the farthest human settlements they knew their name. They were the Northern Border Guard, the King's executioners. They were infamous for their brutality, for taking human thralls and working them into early graves. The man in the center stepped up to the platform. Garrick. You didn't need to be told who he was. The arrogance rolled off him in waves. He had a face that might have been handsome once before a jagged scar tore through his left eyebrow and down to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent cruel sneer. He didn't look at them like they were people. He looked at them like firewood. "I need 5, Garrick said. His voice was like grinding stones. Sturdy ones. The last batch froze before we even made it to the keep. The auctioneer bowed so low he nearly tipped over. "Yes, Alpha Garrick. Of course. Take your pick." Garrick walked the line. He stopped in front of a girl to her left, Tamsin she thought her name was. She was crying softly, her shoulders shaking. Garrick sighed a sound of utter boredom and backhanded her across the face. The crack echoed in the square. Tamsin crumpled to the wetboards. "Too frail," Garrick muttered. "She'll snap." He stopped in front of Maeve. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes fixed on the rusted buckle of his leather pauldron. If you look a wolf in the eye, it's a challenge. If you look at the ground, you're prey. You look at their chest. It was a survival tactic drilled into her since childhood. "This one," Garrick said, tapping her sternum with a heavy calloused finger. The force of it knocked the breath out of her, but she didn't flinch. "She doesn't shake. Wrap her up. And the 4 boys at the end." "A fine choice, my lord." The auctioneer grovelled, practically shaking with relief, as Garrick tossed a heavy leather pouch onto the wood. It hit the boards with the unmistakable heavy clinking of silver. Overpayment. A display of wealth and dominance. A brute with a shaved head and a missing ear stepped onto the block, grabbing her rope. He didn't bother to untie it from the post. He just slashed the hemp with a hunting knife and yanked her forward. She stumbled her knees, slamming into the edge of the platform. Splinters pierced her skin. Pain flared sharp and bright, but she swallowed the gasp. Show no pain. Pain was blood in the water. They dragged them away from the village. No packing, no goodbyes. The heavy iron gates of Everhaven closed behind them with a rusted shriek, sealing her fate. She was no longer Maeve the village outcast. She was property of the Ironjaws. The march north was a masterclass in suffering. The rain turned to sleet by the second day. The ground hardened into jagged, frozen ruts that tore the soles of her feet to ribbons. The 4 boys Garrick had bought walked in a line ahead of her, chained together at the ankles. She was kept separate, tied to the saddle horn of the shaved-headed brute's horse. His name was Auric. He didn't speak. He just rode, setting a pace that kept her at a perpetual, agonizing jog just to avoid being dragged through the slush. Her dress, a thin, patched wool shift, offered no protection against the biting wind. The cold seeped into her bones, a deep, aching numbness that made her limbs feel like lead. But the cold wasn't the worst part. The itch was. Beneath the collar of her dress, resting just above her heart on her left collarbone, the skin burned. It always did when wolves were near. It was a scar thick and raised like silver wire embedded in her flesh, a crescent moon cradling a cracked skull. Her mother had spent her life terrified of it. She used to cover it with soot and dirt, wrapping rags around Maeve's neck, even in the dead of summer. If they see it, Maeve, she would whisper, her hands shaking, "They won't just kill you. They will tear the world apart to keep you." She died of winter fever when Maeve was 12. She took the secret of the mark to her grave. Maeve only knew it meant danger. And now, surrounded by a dozen lethal predators, the scar was practically vibrating against her skin, as if trying to rip itself free. On the 3rd night, they camped in the ruins of an old watchtower. The wolves built a roaring fire, roasting haunches of venison that dripped fat into the flames. The smell made her stomach cramp violently. They had been given water and half a loaf of hardtack to share among the 5 of them. She sat in the corner of the crumbling stone wall, pulling her knees to her chest to conserve heat. One of the boys, a kid no older than 14, was weeping. His feet were black with frostbite. Garrick sat by the fire, wiping grease from his chin with the back of his hand. He noticed the boy crying. "Shut him up!" Garrick said, not even looking away from the flames. Auric stood up. The boy's eyes went wide. He tried to scramble backward, his chains clanking loudly against the stone. "Please!" The boy choked out. "Please, I'm just cold." Auric didn't use a weapon. He just reached down, grabbed the boy by the collar, and threw him against the stone wall. There was a sickening crack. The boy slumped to the ground, his neck bent at a wrong angle. The crying stopped. The other 3 boys stared in muted horror. Maeve didn't look away. She memorized Auric's face. She memorized the way Garrick took another bite of meat without blinking. Animals, she thought. The cynicism settled deep in her gut, hardening into a cold iron shield. There was no reasoning with these creatures. There was only survival. "Strip him!" Garrick ordered Auric, nodding at the dead boy. "Leave the body for the scavengers. Bring his boots to the girl. She's bleeding all over the snow. I didn't pay for crippled livestock." Auric tossed the oversized, stiff leather boots at her feet. They were still warm. She didn't hesitate. She pulled them onto her bleeding, freezing feet. Dignity was dead. Comfort was life. By the 5th day, the terrain shifted. The rolling hills gave way to jagged mountains, their peaks piercing the grey sky like broken teeth. The temperature plummeted. They were entering the heart of the northern wastes. Garrick's keep loomed in the distance. It wasn't a castle. It was a fortress of black stone and iron spikes built into the side of a massive cliff. Smoke billowed from the chimneys, staining the sky. The gates were immense, fashioned from dark, petrified wood and bound in steel. As they approached, the sentries howled from the parapets. It wasn't a greeting. It was a warning. Garrick pulled his horse to a halt, his jaw tightening. Auric reined in beside him. "What is it?" Auric grunted, sniffing the air. "Royal Guard!" Garrick spat, his face twisting in genuine disgust. "The king's banners are on the eastern wall." Auric paled. A wolf as big as a house terrified of a flag. What is the Alpha King doing this far north, checking his borders, or looking for an excuse to thin my ranks? Garrick muttered. He turned in his saddle, glaring at her and the remaining 3 boys. Listen to me, you miserable wretches. The king is in my halls. You will keep your eyes on the dirt. You will not speak. If you embarrass me in front of him, I won't kill you. I'll give you to the Skinners. She kept her face blank, but her pulse hammered against her ribs. The Alpha King? Alaric? The stories about him were worse than the stories about the Ironjaws. He was the wolf of the Blood Moon. He had united the fracturing packs by slaughtering every rival alpha in a single night. They said he drank human blood to keep his youth. They said he was more monster than man, and her scar was burning hotter than ever. The courtyard of the Ironjaw Keep was a hive of frantic activity. Garrick's wolves were scrambling, scrubbing blood off the cobblestones and hiding the more obvious signs of their depravity. In the centre of it all stood the Royal Guard. They were different from Garrick's men. They wore armour of blackened steel, their cloaks a deep, rich crimson. They stood in perfect discipline, a stark contrast to the feral posturing of the Ironjaw wolves. They were corralled into a line near the stables. The mud here was mixed with horse manure and rotting straw. She stood tall, the oversized dead boy's boots heavy on her feet, shivering as the freezing wind whipped across the open stone. "Hold the line," Oric hissed, pacing behind them, his whip trailing in the muck. The heavy oak doors of the main keep swung open, groaning on iron hinges. Silence fell over the courtyard instantly. The wind seemed to stop. Garrick stepped out first, bowing low, but nobody was looking at him. Alaric the Alpha King descended the stone steps. He didn't look like the demon from the stories. He didn't look like a king either. He looked exhausted. He was tall, violently broad across the shoulders, dressed in simple black leather and dark furs. No crown, no gold. His hair was black, falling slightly into eyes that were the colour of ancient oxidized iron. His face was a map of old violence, faded scars over his cheekbones, a slight crook to his nose. He didn't swagger like Garrick. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace. The grace of an apex predator who knew he had nothing left to prove. "My king." Garrick said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "Your presence honors my humble fortress." Alaric didn't look at him. His iron eyes swept the courtyard, taking in the walls, the guards, and finally the line of slaves. "Your borders are weak, Garrick." Alaric's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the soles of her boots. "I saw 3 breached fences on my ride here. Your men are fat and slow." Garrick's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. "We had a harsh winter, my king. Rebuilding is taking time." "Then spend less time raiding human villages and more time cutting timber," Alaric replied coldly. He began to walk across the courtyard, towards them. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run. The burning on her collarbone was excruciating, a searing heat, like a hot brand pressed to her skin. She gripped the fabric of her dress, holding the collar high, her knuckles white. Alaric stopped a few feet from their line. He smelled like wood smoke, cold air, and something dangerously electric. "New stock?" Alaric asked, his tone flat. "Yes, my king." Garrick rushed forward. "Replacements for the scullery and the mines, sturdy ones." Alaric looked at the 3 terrified boys. Then his gaze slid to her. She was looking at his chest, at the intricate silver clasps of his cloak. But she could feel his eyes on her. They were heavy. "She's small," Alaric noted. "She is resilient." Garrick countered, desperate to prove his worth. He stepped up beside her. "Walked the whole way from Everhaven without a complaint." To demonstrate, Garrick grabbed her shoulder. His massive hand dug into her collarbone, right over the scar. She couldn't help it. The pain of his grip combined with the agonizing burn of the mark forced a sharp hiss through her teeth. She flinched, pulling away from his touch. Garrick's eyes flashed with fury. A slave pulling away was an insult. A slave pulling away in front of the king was a death sentence. "Stand still, you filthy bitch!" Garrick snarled. He grabbed the front of her wool dress, yanking her forward to force her to her knees. The old rotted wool gave way. The fabric tore down the seam, ripping open her collar and exposing her left shoulder and chest to the biting cold. She gasped, scrambling to pull the ruined fabric back up, but she was a second too late. Alaric stepped forward, his boot coming down hard on the cobblestones. The air in the courtyard fractured. A heavy, suffocating pressure dropped over them so intense that the three boys beside her collapsed to their knees, gasping for air. Even Garrick stumbled back, his eyes wide, choking under the sheer weight of the king's sudden aura. She couldn't move. She was frozen, looking up at the Alpha King. Alaric was staring directly at her exposed collarbone, at the silver crescent moon and the cracked wolf skull. His iron eyes widened just a fraction. A tremor ran through his massive frame. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. The silence stretched tight as a drawn bowstring. Garrick, struggling against the king's crushing pressure, managed to gasp. "My king! I will kill her for this insult! I will—" "Garrick," Alaric said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a lethal, terrifying edge that silenced the entire courtyard. Alaric slowly reached out. She trembled, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for the strike that would snap her neck. Instead, rough, warm fingertips brushed against her collarbone. He touched the scar. A jolt of electricity shot through her veins, hot and blinding. "Where did you get this?" Alaric whispered. It wasn't a king interrogating a slave. It was a man staring at a ghost. She opened her eyes. He was kneeling in the mud in front of her. The Alpha King was kneeling in the filth, looking up at her. "My mother." She rasped, her throat dry. Alaric swallowed hard. He looked at her bruised face, her shivering shoulders, and the oversized dead boy's boots on her feet. His jaw set. The exhaustion in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden violent storm. He stood up, turning to face Garrick. "She is mine," Alaric said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Garrick blinked, confused and terrified. "My king, she is a human thrall. I bought her at Everhaven for—" Before Garrick could finish his sentence, Alaric closed the distance between them. It happened so fast her eyes couldn't track it. 1 second Alaric was standing in front of her. The next he had Garrick by the throat, lifting the massive iron jaw Alpha off the ground with one hand. Garrick choked his legs, kicking uselessly in the air. "You bought my mate." Alaric snarled, his voice dropping into a monstrous, inhuman register. His eyes bled from iron to glowing amber. "And you made her bleed." Garrick's boots left the cobblestones. The massive iron jaw Alpha, a man who had terrorized the northern borders for a decade, kicked his legs like a drowning child. His hands clawed desperately at the king's thick wrist, trying to pry loose the fingers crushing his windpipe. Alaric didn't blink. The glowing amber of his eyes cut through the freezing drizzle, fixed entirely on the man suffocating in his grip. He wasn't exerting effort. His arm was a rod of black iron. "My king," one of the Iron Jaw lieutenants yelled, stepping forward from the ranks. He drew his sword, the steel scraping loudly against its leather scabbard. Before the lieutenant could take a second step, a shadow detached itself from the royal guard. A towering man with a shaved head and a brutal, scarred jawline slammed the butt of his heavy halberd into the lieutenant's sternum. The crack of breaking ribs echoed like a gunshot. The lieutenant folded vomiting blood onto the wet stones. The courtyard erupted in the metallic scrape of drawn steel. The royal guards formed a seamless half-circle around Alaric and her, their heavy shields locking together with a terrifying synchronized thud. They didn't shout. They didn't roar. They simply stood an immovable wall of blackened armor, waiting for the order to slaughter every Iron Jaw in the keep. The Iron Jaws froze. They were vicious thugs, raiders who preyed on the weak. Faced with a disciplined professional killing force, their feral courage evaporated. They lowered their weapons. Some dropped them entirely into the mud. Alaric ignored the shifting tide of the courtyard. He pulled Garrick closer. "You raid human settlements. You steal their children. You buy and sell them like cattle on my borders." Alaric's voice was a low, vibrating hum that rattled her teeth. "I turned a blind eye because you held the Northern Pass. I thought you were a necessary monster. But you are not a monster, Garrick. You are just a parasite." Xai. Garrick choked out a wet, pitiful sound. "You bought my mate." Alaric repeated the word mate, sounding foreign and heavy on his tongue. "You bruised her skin. You made her bleed on the ice." Alaric didn't snap his neck. He didn't offer a quick death. He tightened his grip. She watched Garrick's eyes bulge. She watched the blood vessels burst in his sclera, turning the whites of his eyes a violent crimson. The arrogant sneer that had permanently marked his face dissolved into absolute, primal terror. She felt no pity. She felt no triumph, either. She only felt the cold, hard reality of the world she lived in. Violence was the only currency that mattered, and the king possessed all the wealth. With a sickening crunch of collapsing cartilage, Alaric crushed Garrick's throat. He didn't toss the body away. He opened his hand and let the corpse drop into the mud at his boots. Garrick hit the ground with a heavy, unceremonious thud. Dead meat. Alaric turned his head, slowly sweeping his glowing eyes over the remaining iron-jaw wolves. "Oric!" Alaric called out. The brute with the missing ear flinched as if struck by lightning. He stepped forward, dropping to his knees so fast his kneecaps slammed against the stone. He pressed his forehead into the filthy mud. "My king." Oric trembled. "You are Alpha here now." Alaric stated. "It wasn't an honor. It was a threat. Burn Garrick's body. Tear down his banners. And if I hear one whisper of human thralls being traded in this territory again, I will not bring my guard. I will come alone, and I will leave nothing but ash. Do you understand? Yes, yes, my king." Oric kept his face pressed to the dirt. Alaric finally turned his back on the pack. His eyes shifted from predatory amber back to that dull, exhausted iron. He looked down at her. She was still kneeling on the frozen stones. Her hands clutched the torn edges of her wool dress together, desperately trying to cover her exposed shoulder and the silver scar that had triggered this massacre. She was shivering violently, her breath hitching in her chest. He didn't save her. Her cynical mind screamed the warning loud and clear over the pounding of her heart. He killed a thief who stole his property. That was all. She had traded a cruel master for a lethal one. Alaric reached up and unclasped the heavy, fur-lined black cloak from his shoulders. He knelt in the mud for the second time, ignoring the filth seeping into his leather trousers. He draped the heavy garment over her shaking frame. It smelled like cedarwood frost and the sharp tang of ozone. It was impossibly warm. "You are safe," he said quietly. She looked at the corpse bleeding out 3 feet away. She looked back at the king's face. "I am never safe." She whispered, her voice raw and entirely devoid of hope. Alaric stared at her for a long moment. A muscle worked in his jaw. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't promise her the world. He just nodded once, acknowledging the truth in her words. He stood up, offering her his hand. His palm was calloused, stained with Garrick's blood. She didn't take it. She placed her hands on her own knees and pushed herself up her muscles, screaming in protest. The oversized dead boy's boots felt like lead weights. She swayed light-headed from the cold and the adrenaline crash. Before she could fall, Alaric stepped in. He didn't ask permission. He scooped her up into his arms. The sudden movement made her gasp, her hands instinctively flying up to brace against his armored chest. He was solid, unyielding. "We ride for Stonehaven," Alaric commanded, carrying her toward the heavily armored column of his guard. "Now." She didn't sleep for the first 2 days of the journey south. Exhaustion dragged at her eyelids, filling her head with cotton, but every time she drifted off, she jerked awake, expecting the crack of Oryx's whip or the freezing sting of the northern wind. Instead, she found herself in the back of a covered supply wagon, hollowed out and lined with thick bear skins. It swayed rhythmically over the rutted roads. They fed her. Real food. Not hardtack and dirty water, but thick venison stew and warm bread heavily buttered. The first time the guard brought her a bowl, she ate it in 3 massive, desperate bites. 10 minutes later, she threw it all up over the side of the wagon. Her shrunken stomach couldn't handle the richness. After that, she was careful. She ate slow. When they gave her a whole loaf of bread, she ate half and shoved the rest deep inside the folds of the king's cloak, which she refused to take off. She hoarded it. One never knew when the kindness would stop. One never knew when they would remember she was just a human. On the 3rd evening, the wagon halted early. They made camp in a dense grove of silver birch trees. The air here was less biting, lacking the brutal edge of the northern wastes. A man climbed into the back of her wagon. He was older, his hair a distinguished salt and pepper, wearing a heavy leather satchel. He lacked the predatory bulk of the guards. "I am Thomas," he said, keeping his distance. His voice was gentle, lacking the gravelly undertone of the wolves. "I am the king's physician. He asked me to look at your feet." She pulled her knees to her chest. "They're fine. You are wearing boots 3 sizes too big, caked in dried blood." Thomas pointed out mildly. "They are not fine. Please, if infection sets in, you will lose the toes." She stared at him. He didn't move to force her. He just waited. Slowly she extended her legs. He carefully removed the stiff leather boots. The stench of old blood and unwashed flesh filled the small space. Thomas didn't flinch. He unwrapped the crude, filthy rags she had bound her feet in. Her soles were a mess of raw blisters, deep fissures, and blackened skin from frostbite. He cleaned them with a warm, stinging liquid that smelled of herbs, then applied a thick, waxy salve that instantly numbed the throbbing ache. He worked in silence, binding them in clean white linen. "Thank you." She muttered the words, tasting like sand. She wasn't used to gratitude. Thomas smiled, packing his satchel. "Save your thanks for the king. He halted the march early so you could rest without the wagon bouncing you around." He climbed out. A moment later, a massive shadow filled the back of the wagon. Alaric. He didn't climb in. He stood on the ground outside, his arms resting on the wooden tailgate. The campfire behind him cast his face in sharp relief, highlighting the faded scars over his cheekbones. He looked at her bandaged feet, then up to her face. "Thomas says you'll keep your toes," Alaric said. "For now," she replied, pulling his heavy cloak tighter around her shoulders. Silence stretched between them. It wasn't comfortable. It was heavy with unspoken questions. The burning on her collarbone had subsided into a dull, constant ache since they left the Iron Jaw Keep. It only flared when he looked at her directly. Like right now. "Why do you hoard the bread?" Alaric asked suddenly. She stiffened. She thought she had hidden it well. "Habit. There is enough food in this camp to feed a small army for a month. You don't need to hide crusts in your pockets. Until you get bored," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Or until I say the wrong thing. Or until you decide that whatever a mate is, I'm not doing it right. Then the food stops. I know how this works. I've been a stray dog long enough to know that nobody feeds you forever." Alaric didn't get angry. He didn't offer a booming defense of his honor. He just looked tired. "A mate isn't a pet, Maeve," he said, using her name for the first time. She hadn't told it to him. He must have asked the other boys from the auction block. "Then what is it?" she challenged. "A slave with a fancy title you bought me with silver. You own the paper from the auctioneer. Don't dress it up in noble words." He looked away, staring out into the dark woods. I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to take you away from him. If I hadn't given Garrick the silver, he would have killed you the moment my back was turned, just out of spite." He looked back at her, his iron eyes locking onto hers. The sheer intensity of his gaze made her breath hitch. "The bond between mates, it is an anchor," Alaric said quietly. "For my kind, our beasts are always raging, always pushing against the bars. A mate is the one soul in the world that quiets the noise. When I saw you in that courtyard, it was the first time in 10 years my head was quiet." She stared at him, trying to find the lie, trying to find the manipulation. But there was only a bleak, naked honesty. "And my scar?" she asked, dropping her voice to a whisper. Alaric's expression hardened. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the stoic mask of a king preparing for war. "We will talk of the scar when we are behind the walls of Stonehaven," he said, "not out here in the dark." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with a stomach full of warm stew and a head full of terrifying questions. Stonehaven did not look like a place of comfort. It was a brutalist masterpiece of military architecture carved directly into the side of a sheer granite mountain. Its walls were impossibly high, bristling with ballistas and iron spikes. It was a fortress designed to withstand a siege of thousands, but inside it was entirely different. The inner courtyard was paved with smooth, pale stones that radiated heat from subterranean thermal springs. The air smelled of roasting meats, pine needles, and something sweet like spun sugar. People moved with purpose, but without fear. Humans and wolves walked side by side, carrying crates, laughing, shouting orders. She was escorted past the bustling courtyard, deep into the heart of the keep, up a sweeping spiral staircase, carved from a single piece of dark timber. Her assigned chambers were larger than the entire tavern in Everhaven. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the room, draped in heavy furs and silk sheets. A fire roared in a stone hearth large enough to roast a pig. Tapestries woven with silver thread hung on the walls, depicting howling wolves and crescent moons. She stood in the center of the room, clutching her half-eaten loaf of bread, feeling entirely out of place. The dirt under her fingernails felt like an insult to the pristine rugs beneath her bandaged feet. The heavy oak door opened. A woman bustled in, carrying a stack of neatly folded linens. She was human middle-aged, with kind eyes, and a no-nonsense bun pinned tightly to the back of her head. "I am Clara," she said, her voice bright and brisk. "Head of the king's household, don't just stand there looking like a cornered rabbit child. The copper tub is full, the water is hot, and if we don't scrub that mud off you soon, it's going to become a permanent part of your skin." She didn't argue. She let Clara guide her behind an ornate folding screen. The copper tub was massive, steaming heavily, the water infused with lavender and crushed mint. Clara helped her peel away the king's heavy cloak, and then the ruined, blood-stained wool dress. She stood naked, shivering despite the heat of the fire. Her body was a map of bruises, yellowing marks on her ribs, from her uncle purple blooms on her arms, from Oryx's rough handling, and the angry red skin around the silver scar on her chest. Clara didn't gasp. She didn't offer pity. She just handed her a rough sponge and a block of soap that smelled like wildflowers. "In you go," she instructed. She stepped into the water. The heat hit her frozen skin like a physical blow. Pain flared up her legs, a sharp, burning agony as the blood rushed back into half-dead tissue. She bit down on her lip hard enough to taste copper, refusing to cry out. Clara took the sponge from her rigid hand. "I'll do the back. You breathe." She washed her with a firm, maternal efficiency. She scrubbed the grime of the northern wastes from her skin, washing away the smell of the cattle market, the stench of Oryx's horse, and the cold dread that had settled into her marrow. When the water turned grey, she stepped out. Clara wrapped her in a towel spun from soft, warm cotton, thicker than any fabric she had ever felt. She dressed her in a simple, elegant gown of forest green wool, soft against her raw skin. "Clara," she said, finding her voice as she combed the tangles from her wet hair. "Yes, my lady." She flinched at the title. "I'm not a lady, I'm Maeve." She hesitated, looking at Clara in the silver-backed mirror on the vanity. What is this place truly? Humans walking freely among wolves' mates. Clara stopped combing. She met her eyes in the mirror. Her kind expression faded into something guarded and solemn. "King Alaric is not like the alphas of the Outer Territories, Maeve. He remembers the old ways, before the Blood Wars, before the packs fractured and started hunting humans for sport." She lowered her voice. "But you must understand, his protection only goes so far. There are those in this court who view humans as nothing more than livestock, and they view a human mate to the Alpha King as an abomination." She reached forward, gently tapping the fabric of Maeve's dress right over her collarbone. "And if they see what you carry on your skin," Clara whispered, "they won't just whisper behind their hands. They will start a civil war." A knock on the heavy oak door shattered the quiet intimacy of the moment. "Enter," Clara called out, stepping back and dropping her gaze to the floor in a sign of deep respect. Alaric walked in. He had washed. The blood and mud of the journey were gone, replaced by a clean tunic of dark leather and a heavy silver chain resting against his chest. His black hair was damp, pushed back from his face. Without the dirt and the exhaustion, he was devastatingly striking. The raw power of him filled the room, pressing against the walls. "Leave us, Clara," Alaric commanded softly. Clara bowed and hurried from the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The click of the latch sounded like a prison cell locking. She stood by the fire, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. The green wool dress suddenly felt like armor. Alaric walked slowly toward the hearth, stopping a few feet away. He looked at her, taking in the clean hair, the flushed skin, the absence of mud. For a fleeting second, something dangerously possessive flashed in his iron eyes, but he blinked it away, burying it beneath a mask of absolute control. "Are the chambers to your liking?" he asked. "They are very large," she answered truthfully. "And very warm. It's a very nice cage." Alaric sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It is not a cage, Maeve. The door is unlocked. You can walk the halls, you can go to the gardens. You are free. I was bought on a wooden block for 4 coppers. You killed a man for touching me. I am guarded by wolves. I am not free, Alaric." She spoke the words flatly, refusing to let the emotion break her voice. "So tell me the truth. Stop playing the noble king. Tell me why I am here. Tell me what this scar means." Alaric dropped his hand. He looked at her for a long, heavy minute. "It means you are a ghost, Maeve," Alaric said, his voice dropping into that rumbling cadence that made her chest vibrate. "That mark the crescent and the cracked skull is the crest of the Corvinus bloodline." She frowned. "I don't know what that is. They were humans, hundreds of years ago. They didn't fear wolves. They bound themselves to us. They were our anchors, our tacticians, our equals. The first Alpha King took a Corvinus woman as his mate, and together they built the first united pack." He took a step closer. The heat radiating off him was immense. But the other Alphas grew jealous of the humans' influence. They staged a coup. They slaughtered the king, and they hunted the Corvinus bloodline to extinction. Or so we thought. Alaric reached out, stopping just an inch from touching her shoulder. "Your mother hid you because if the highborn wolves of my court know a Corvinus lives, they will know you have the power to break their beasts or to make me unstoppable. They will kill you to prevent either." She stared at him, the cynical shield around her heart cracking just a fraction. He wasn't holding her here for pleasure. He was holding her here because if she walked out those doors, she was a dead woman. "So, she whispered, looking up into his terrifying iron eyes. "What do we do now?" Alaric's jaw tightened. "Now, little ghost, we prepare for war." The Royal Court of Stonehaven did not operate on laws. It operated on a brutal, silent currency of scent and posture. Alaric did not present her as his mate. He presented her as a ward of the crown, a human he had confiscated from a traitor. It was a flimsy shield, a lie constructed of wet paper, but it forced the high-born wolves to maintain a veneer of civility. They hated her instantly. She felt it the moment she walked into the great hall on her 4th night in the keep. The hall was a cavernous space of vaulted stone, lit by hundreds of thick tallow candles that cast flickering, aggressive shadows against the walls. The air was thick. It smelled of heavy spiced wine roasted boar and the sharp, musky undertone of predators in a confined space. It made the hair on her arms stand up. Silence rippled outward from the heavy oak doors as she stepped inside. Conversations died. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. They were dressed in velvets and silks, dyed in deep crimsons and midnight blues, their fingers heavy with gold rings. They looked nothing like the feral brutes of the Ironjaw pack, but beneath the fine clothes the monster was the same. She could see it in the way they tracked her movements, their pupils dilating slightly. To them, a human in the great hall was either a servant or a snack. She was dressed in a gown of charcoal silk, an unspoken declaration of the king's protection, which only confused and enraged them more. She kept her spine violently straight. She didn't look at the floor. She didn't look them in the eye. She looked at the heavy iron chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Survival habit. Alaric sat at the head table, a massive slab of dark oak on a raised dais. He was speaking with a man who looked like an aging hawk, but as she entered, Alaric's iron eyes locked onto her. The tension in his jaw was visible from across the room. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. She walked toward the empty chair placed slightly behind his right shoulder. It was a precarious position. Close enough to be under his guard, submissive enough not to claim the seat of a queen. Before she could reach the dais, a man stepped into her path. He was tall, lean, and moved with a liquid grace that made her stomach tighten. He wore a dark blue doublet, stitched with silver thread. His hair was blonde, pulled back tight, and his eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of winter ice. "Well," he purred. His voice was smooth-cultured and dripping with venom. "Garrick's little stray. You clean up remarkably well for something bought out of the mud. Step aside, Lord Cassian." Alaric's voice cut through the hall. It wasn't loud, but it carried a physical weight that made several nearby nobles flinch. Cassian didn't flinch. He smiled, a thin stretching of lips over remarkably white teeth. He bowed to Alaric, a shallow, mocking gesture. "My king," Cassian said, turning back to her. He stepped closer. The smell of him hit her cloves' expensive oil and the copper tang of fresh blood. He had killed something recently. "I only wish to welcome the girl. We so rarely have humans in the upper levels who aren't carrying trays. Tell me, girl, what trick did you perform to earn silk?" He reached out his long, pale fingers, brushing the fabric of her sleeve. Beneath her dress, the silver scar on her collarbone flared to life. It didn't burn with pain this time. It hummed. A strange, vibrating heat radiated from her chest, spreading down her arms. Cassian's smug smile vanished. He snatched his hand back as if he had touched a hot iron stove. He blinked, a flash of genuine primal confusion crossing his pale eyes. He stared at his fingertips, then stared at her. She didn't step back. The cynicism that had kept her alive in Everhaven hardened into something cold and sharp. She realized in that split second that whatever magic her mother had cursed her with, it wasn't just a beacon. It was a weapon. "The king prefers my company to the company of sycophants," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and loud enough for the first 3 rows of tables to hear. A collective gasp echoed in the hall. A human insulting a high-born lord was a death sentence. Cassian's eyes flashed a murderous gold. His upper lip curled back, exposing elongated canines. He took a half-step forward, his beast rushing to the surface. Cassian. Alaric was out of his chair. He didn't walk. He materialized at the edge of the dais. The oppressive, suffocating aura he had unleashed in the Ironjaw courtyard slammed down on the great hall. Goblets rattled on the wooden tables. A female wolf near the fireplace dropped to her knees, gasping for breath. "Touch her again." Alaric promised, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "And I will feed your hands to the hounds." Cassian swallowed hard. The golden glow faded from his eyes, replaced by a deep, simmering hatred. He bowed again, deeper this time. "Forgive me, my king. I forgot myself." Cassian shot her one last venomous look before melting back into the crowd. She walked up the wooden steps of the dais and stood by her chair. Her legs were shaking so hard she thought her knees would buckle, but she locked them tight. Alaric sat down slowly. He didn't look at her, but his hand reached out under the table, his rough, warm fingers wrapping around her freezing wrist. The touch grounded her. "He knows." She whispered the words, barely carrying over the renewed chatter of the hall. "He felt something when he touched me." Alaric's grip tightened briefly. "Cassian is the head of the ruling council. He commands the Southern Legions. If he suspects what you are, he will not challenge me openly. He will try to remove you in the dark. Then let him come." She muttered the words, surprising even her. Alaric finally turned to look at her. The exhaustion was back in his eyes, fighting a losing battle against the rage. "You do not know these monsters, Maeve. They have spent centuries perfecting the art of murder, and I have spent my whole life perfecting the art of not dying," she replied. "They sold me for copper. Let's see what I cost them in blood." The assassination attempt came 3 days later, wrapped in the guise of a winter hunt. Tradition demanded the king lead the highborn lords into the white pine forest to cull the feral boars before the deep snows set in. Tradition also demanded that the king bring his favored court members to observe from the safety of the hunting pavilions. She hated the woods. The trees here were ancient, their thick, twisted trunks covered in grey lichen. The canopy was so dense it choked out the afternoon sun, leaving the forest floor locked in a perpetual freezing twilight. Clara had dressed her in thick riding leathers lined with sheared sheepskin. She was seated on a massive black gelding, flanked by 2 of Alaric's royal guards. The hunting pavilion was a raised wooden platform, adorned with furs and braziers perched on the edge of a steep ravine. Alaric and the highborns, including Lord Cassian, were somewhere in the valley below. The distant sounds of baying hounds and shouting men drifted up on the biting wind. She stood near the edge of the platform, staring down into the tree line. The 2 royal guards stood rigidly by the entrance of the pavilion, their heavy halberds resting against the wooden rails. Something was wrong. The wind shifted. The smell of pine and burning charcoal from the braziers was suddenly overpowered by a stench that made her stomach heave. It smelled of rotting meat, stagnant water, and pure, unfiltered madness. The horses tied beneath the pavilion began to scream. Not neighing, screaming. They reared up, snapping their tethers, and bolted blindly into the trees. "Hold your ground!" one of the royal guards shouted, drawing his heavy broadsword. A massive shadow detached itself from the tree canopy above the pavilion. It didn't jump. It fell like a boulder, crushing the wooden roof of the structure. Timber splintered. The braziers overturned, spilling hot coals across the wooden floorboards. The beast landed in the center of the platform. It was a wolf, but not like Alaric or his men. It was monstrously deformed, standing 8 feet tall on its hind legs. Its fur was patchy and matted with dried blood. Its spine was twisted, its jaw unhinged in a permanent slavering snarl. Its eyes were milky white and entirely devoid of reason. A rogue. A feral. The first royal guard lunged, driving his broadsword toward the beast's chest. The rogue didn't even try to dodge. It took the steel blade deep into its ribs, didn't bleed, and backhanded the guard with a massive clawed paw. The impact shattered the man's armor. He flew off the platform, disappearing into the ravine with a sickening crunch. The second guard hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was enough. The rogue snapped its jaws around his throat, crushing his windpipe in a spray of bright arterial blood. Then the milky white eyes locked onto her. Cassian. Her mind put the pieces together with cold, cynical clarity. He hadn't sent an assassin. He had released a feral, starved and rabid, and pointed it at the pavilion. A tragic accident. The wild claiming another human life. The rogue lunged. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She dropped to the wooden deck, throwing herself beneath a heavy, overturned table as the beast crashed into the railing where she had stood a second before. Wood splintered and groaned. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her fingers searching frantically for a weapon. Her hand brushed against the heavy iron poker used for the braziers. It was red hot on one end. The rogue flipped the table away with a flick of its massive wrist. It stood over her, saliva dripping from its jaws, burning holes into her leather tunic. She didn't think. She drove the red-hot iron poker straight upward, plunging it deep into the beast's left eye. The rogue shrieked a sound like tearing metal. It reeled back, thrashing violently, blinding itself further in its panic. She scrambled to her feet, backing toward the edge of the ruined platform, her chest heaving. The silver scar on her collarbone was burning so fiercely it felt like a branding iron pressed to her flesh. Before the rogue could recover, a roar shook the forest. It wasn't the baying of a hound. It was a sound that commanded the earth to shatter. Alaric hit the platform. He had shifted. He was a nightmare of black fur and corded muscle, larger than the rogue, radiating a terrifying primordial heat. He didn't use a weapon. He hit the feral beast with the force of a battering ram, driving it into the stone wall of the ravine. The violence was absolute. Alaric didn't fight to subdue. He fought to erase. He tore into the rogue, his jaws crushing bone, his claws shredding thick hide. Blood coated the wooden planks. The feral beast fought back, dragging its jagged claws across Alaric's flank, but the Alpha King felt no pain. He was consumed by the beast. Within seconds, the rogue was dead. Its throat ripped out, its chest caved in. But Alaric didn't stop. He continued to tear at the corpse, lost in the bloodlust, his monstrous form vibrating with a rage that could not be quenched. The royal guards who had finally caught up stopped at the edge of the platform, their faces pale. They lowered their weapons. No one approached an alpha lost to his beast. It was suicide. She looked at the massive black wolf tearing the corpse to shreds. She looked at the blood soaking the wood. The bond between mates is an anchor, he had told her. A mate is the one soul in the world that quiets the noise. She took a step forward. "My lady, no." Thomas, the physician, had arrived, his face ashen. He reached for her arm. She shook him off. She didn't walk slowly. She walked directly into the pool of blood, her boots slipping on the slick wood. "Alaric," she said. Her voice was calm, unshaking. The massive black wolf froze. He dropped a chunk of torn flesh from his jaws. He turned his massive blood-soaked head toward her. His eyes weren't iron. They weren't amber. They were completely black, devoid of anything human. He snarled a low, warning rumble that vibrated up through her boots. He crouched, his muscles coiling to spring, to kill her. She didn't stop. She closed the distance. She reached up, her small, pale hand resting flat against his massive, blood-matted snout. The moment her skin made contact with his fur, the scar on her chest pulsed with a blinding silver light that bled through the heavy fabric of her tunic. The reaction was instantaneous. The crushing, suffocating aura of the beast evaporated. Alaric gasped, a harsh, human sound ripping from his throat. The black fur began to recede, bone cracking and shifting in a rapid, violent reversal. Within seconds he was kneeling on the wooden planks, human again, completely naked and covered in gore. He was panting, his head bowed, his hands braced against the ruined wood. She stripped out of her heavy leather coat and draped it over his broad shoulders. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were back to their tired, oxidized iron. He looked at her, then down at the ruined ferrule, then over to where Lord Cassian was standing among the trees, below his pale face, looking up at the pavilion in absolute horrified disbelief. Cassian had seen the silver light. He had seen her break the Alpha's bloodlust. Alaric stood up, pulling the coat tight around himself. He didn't shout. He looked down at Cassian with a cold, dead certainty. "The hunt is over," Alaric said to the gathered crowd below. "Call the council. We return to the keep. Now." The council room was a circular chamber located deep in the bedrock beneath Stonehaven. Its walls were raw, unhewn granite. The only light came from a massive circular hearth in the center of the room. There were no chairs. The 12 ruling lords stood around the fire, their shadows dancing monstrously against the stone. She stood at Alaric's side. She wore the charcoal silk again, but this time she didn't feel like she was wearing a costume. She felt like she was wearing armor. Cassian stood directly across the fire from them. He looked nervous, though he tried to hide it behind his usual mask of aristocratic boredom. "A tragedy in the woods, my king," Cassian said smoothly. "A feral breaching the perimeter. The guard captain should be executed for such a lapse in security. There was no lapse," Alaric said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Ferals do not coordinate attacks on hunting pavilions. They are drawn by scent. Someone dragged slaughterhouse offal across the eastern ridge and laid a trail directly to the platform where my ward was standing." Murmurs erupted among the council members. "Treason!" Lord Bram, a heavily scarred veteran, growled. "Who would dare?" Cassian sighed, examining his manicured fingernails. "If you are implying, my king, that someone in this room orchestrated this, you insult the bloodline of every lord present over a human stray. It is a dangerous accusation to make without proof." "I don't need proof." Alaric counted the iron in his eyes, turning a dangerous shade of amber. "I know it was you, Cassian. You couldn't stomach the insult in the Great Hall. You couldn't stomach a human showing you disrespect." Cassian's mask finally cracked. He threw his arms wide. "Yes, because it is an abomination. You bring a mud-stained thrall into our halls, dress her in silk, and demand we bow. She is livestock. Our ancestors built this kingdom by mastering the beasts and conquering the weak. You weaken us, Alaric. You cling to old fairy tales while the packs fracture. The council will not stand for it. If you press this, it means civil war. The southern legions will march by dawn." The room fell deadly silent. The threat was out in the open. Alaric had a choice: execute Cassian and plunge the kingdom into a bloody war that would kill thousands, or back down and let the highborns rule through fear. The systemic rot was deep. Alaric couldn't cut it out with a sword without bleeding the kingdom dry. She looked at Cassian's smug face. She looked at the other lords, their eyes shifting, calculating the odds of a coup. They thought they owned the world because they had fangs. They thought they were the apex. Her mother had died, coughing up blood in a freezing hut, terrified of these monsters. She had been sold on a wooden block like a piece of spoiled meat. She was done being terrified. She was done hiding. She stepped away from Alaric, moving to the very edge of the roaring fire. "You talk of your ancestors," she said. Her voice cut through the heavy silence, clear and cold as ice. "You talk of how you built this kingdom. You are wrong." Cassian laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Silence, human. The adults are speaking." She didn't look at Alaric for permission. She reached up, grabbed the high collar of her charcoal silk dress, and tore the fabric straight down to her sternum. The silver scar, the crescent moon cradling the cracked skull, was exposed to the firelight. The reaction in the room was not shock. It was a physical, seismic event. The moment the firelight hit the Corvinus mark, the latent power in her blood flared. It wasn't just heat this time. It was an invisible crushing weight. It slammed into the 12 lords like a solid wall of stone. Cassian choked, dropping to his knees instantly. Beside him, Lord Bram collapsed, his hands clawing at his own throat as his beast was violently forced into submission. The ancient magic bound in her bloodline, the magic that had broken the first wolves to the saddle, woke up, demanding absolute obedience from the predators in the room. She didn't stop. She walked slowly around the fire, her ruined dress flapping around her ankles. Every time she passed a council member, they were forced lower to the ground. They couldn't look at her. Their bodies shook with the effort of just drawing breath. She stopped in front of Cassian. He was on his hands and knees, staring at the raw granite floor, a line of drool hanging from his pale lips. The aristocratic arrogance was gone, replaced by the same primal terror she had seen in the eyes of the boys on the auction block. "My ancestors built this kingdom," she said to the top of his head. "We taught you how to build walls instead of sleeping in caves. We taught you how to be kings instead of rabid dogs. And when you grew strong, you butchered us in our beds because you were afraid of the leash." She leaned down, grabbing a fistful of Cassian's blonde hair. She yanked his head back, forcing him to look at the silver scar on her chest. He whimpered, a high-born lord head of the Southern Legions whimpering like a beaten pup. "I am the Corvinus heir," she whispered loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. "I am not livestock. I am the anchor, and I am your ruin." She let go of his hair. Cassian slumped back to the floor. She turned back to Alaric. He had not fallen to his knees. The mark didn't crush him. It fed him. He stood taller, the sheer aura of his alpha power amplified by the bond radiating out like a dark sun. He was magnificent. And he was terrifying. She walked back to his side. She didn't cover her shoulder. "Lord Cassian has committed treason," she said, looking at the king. She wasn't a cynical, bruised slave anymore. She was a weapon forged in the mud, finally unsheathed. "The penalty is death." Alaric didn't hesitate. He drew the heavy iron broadsword from his hip. The metallic ring of the steel sang through the silent chamber. He walked over to Cassian, who could not even raise a hand to defend himself under the crushing weight of the Corvinus mark. With one clean, brutal swing, Alaric severed Cassian's head from his shoulders. The council members remained on the floor, trembling, staring at the blood pooling on the granite. Alaric turned to them, his sword dripping. "The old ways are dead." Alaric proclaimed, his voice booming with a power that left no room for debate. "The Corvinus line has returned to the throne. Anyone who speaks of human thralls, anyone who buys or sells flesh in my kingdom, will meet the same fate as Cassian and Garrick. Swear fealty to your queen, or die on this floor." One by one, the proud, corrupt lords of Stonehaven dragged themselves forward, pressing their foreheads to the blood-stained stone at her feet. She looked down at them, feeling the cold air on her bare skin, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of power. She had been sold to the cruelest pack in the north, meant to die in the snow. Instead, she had conquered their king, broken their council, and taken the crown. They were going to tear their corrupt world apart, and they were going to enjoy every second of it. If this dark medieval werewolf tale of bloody revenge and fated mates kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Maeve went from a bruised slave on the auction block to breaking the corrupt highborn council to their knees. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think the Southern Legions will retaliate for Cassian's death? Or is the Corvinus mark too powerful to challenge? Don't forget to share this video with your fellow fantasy romance lovers. And subscribe for more grounded, intense stories. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload.